Okay, so because then I can't see the.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
You can just switch back at the end.
Okay. Great.
Hey everyone, we have Konstantin, the CEO of BlockDaemon. He'll be doing a talk on the role of early network custodians. Can you guys confirm in the chat that you can hear him? Hey Kevin, can you hear me?
So you have a couple of customers. There's a little bit of go. But, okay, let me see what's going on. So sorry, let me just. Oh, am I muted? No, I'm not. I have an echo, but okay. Well, I guess that's what it is. All right, and so we have this is a sort of visual representation of what our offering looks like. And one of the key things that we get
Yeah, I
asked
can
all
see
the
you.
time
So Julian will be joining us in 5 minutes. I'll got food
is
poisoning,
what does
so yeah, so she's good. So would you guys be able to make this a fireside chat?
sorry guys, I'm trying to figure out what's going on.
Like
Sorry,
I
I'm
am sick
getting.
and dying right now, so if I sound dead,
Can you
yeah, I have
guys
a really
hear?
high fever and chills.
Yeah,
I know.
Sinju, can you hear us?
So I'll invite Julian up once he joins the room. Then
Sorry
you
guys,
guys can
I don't know really what's
respond.
going on. I'm trying to. Zinju? Okay, great. Can you guys hear me? Sorry, guys. I'm really sorry about this. Can you guys hear me still? Can you hear me now? Okay, I'm just going to continue talking. Okay, great. So one of the key questions we always get asked is what does it mean if you have a solution like BlockDaemon that actually aids the management of nodes? What does that mean for decentralization? And so decentralization obviously is a little bit of a philosophical absolute here, but I'm trying to give it a definition, and I also want to define what network custody means in this concept. And so there's a couple of things that I'll touch on. The first one is that when I talk about network custody, really what I mean is the people who physically secure the network, which are ultimately early on validators and then full nodes. And so the people who maintain the ledger and store it. And so one of the important things that we found is that the degree of network custody required changes over time. And so any open source distributed tech ledger protocol that's launched starts from a central point, even if it's just a Satoshi, and then expands over time. And so over time, networks, and specifically, ideally, decentralized networks, should grow and grow and grow and expand the node operations. The sort of kind of goal for me every time I think about decentralization is that there should be thousands of individual node operators who are independent from each other across multiple dimensions, servers, capital, regional, tooling-wise. Now, that's actually, I would say at this moment in time, not appropriate for any blockchain-centric project that we've seen. Ultimately, with the miners on Bitcoin, there's a capital interest, for example, with Ethereum. Actually, there were actually a lot of server instances around Ethereum where it was very heavy on Amazon East. So there's so many different components that make this up that this is really something we can only thrive towards over time. And even something that's widely used, like Docker images, and Docker itself has actually security flaws that can affect decentralization. And so this is an interesting thing to think about, but it's something that we're still very far away of. And so the real thing here is progressive decentralizations, so progressive centralization. Agents provide network capability and lay the path for the evolution of tooling usable by anyone for free. And so that's a really important point, because when we start working in a centralized manner with a project, so let's say there's a couple of them on here, and you see I have a node count really more as a sort of an abstract indicator of degree of decentralization. But you have networks that are fairly new, and then they expand over time, and you can see some of the names, for example, where and some of this needs to be moved around. But what you can see here is that tooling needs change over time. So you have multi-cloud testing, bug management, you have staking, reporting, local backup systems. Later on, when a network is aiming for listings, it wants to have APIs, it needs high availability nodes, load balancing. The tooling structure just changes because those type of custodians and exchanges have different infrastructure requirements. And then further on, when you look at developers, it's all about monitoring plugins, further abstraction layers like Infura, et cetera, et cetera. And so, so one of the key points I want to make here, that network custody is a long-term game. And so that means that only with time and history does a network participant become reliable, and the network itself becomes reliable over time. And so very similar to actually, if anyone ever tried launching a full archive, you know what I mean. But nodes also age over time and become more important in networks. And so one of the things that we found really curious and interesting is that every network speaks its own language. And so we're becoming these sort of hubs of knowledge when we actually bring best practices to these networks, and really try to help networks very early on to ensure that it's functional and that the network is true to its own mission. And a lot of that is finding how to ensure that the economic setup of a network allows the network to be decentralized over time. And so very often mistakes are getting made very early that are very difficult to change over time, because governance models, for example, once you have stakeholders holding over 50%, it's very difficult, depending on the consensus model, to actually figure out how to make economical changes that are good for newer, smaller entities to come in, for example, to run nodes in a network. And so that's been an interesting concept for us to kind of think about and educate networks about. The important part here, not a zero-sum game. So the key part in our discussions is very often actually with the physical investors early on, as well as actually other validator partners and the project themselves. Because it's important that early on the competition around getting the best price of a token or getting the offering the lowest fee to suck up stake, it's very important that people understand that you want a thriving validator ecosystem over time. And that means that there's a lot of different components that are part of that, which is, some of it, now very popular grants, sort of some way of kind of equaling the playing field for all the different operators. I think at this stage, what we see in a lot of networks is, and what we're doing a lot of education around, is that a lot of the larger investors are used to manage token yield and token economics. And so they reach out to validators and start negotiating, and one of the core principles is that there's competition between the validators to have low and competitive fees. What we've seen that do is that it means that larger validators that are capitalized really well can offer very low fees over a period of time, even at a loss to operate nodes to suck up large stakes, and ultimately price out smaller operators who actually need to run a profitable setup in order to pay their respective cloud or server bills. And so that's been really interesting for us to observe. And it's interesting that I would say in the investor community, that is not very well understood. That it's not in the interest of a large stakeholder in a network to get the best deal on the validator fees in a network. And so that's one of many issues we see. Obviously, the others are that if you have free staking on exchanges and custodians, you also bring network custodians on that aren't necessarily aligned with the long-term ambition of the project, but they can actually, among themselves, probably dictate the governance of the project. So those are stakeholders hugely incentivized by liquidity, volume, those type of incentives. And so that's not per se a bad thing. It just means that everything else needs to be pitch perfect, because otherwise you just become a tool for speculators. And so, and in any open source decentralized project over time, these networks are very, very difficult to build. And it takes a long time to get it right. So there's going to be a lot of iterations and growth around the network custodial setup that you have. And so we're learning that a lot, where, for example, as BlockDaemon, we do run a lot of nodes. We do work across, large projects, all major ones really, that we're conscious of not going in with a super low fee in order to suck up early on delegations. One of the things that, and people do that mostly because we've seen that once people delegate, tokens hardly ever move. And so the business premise then is that people can, suck up a lot and then increase fees over time. That can be very damaging to a physical network. And so that's been interesting to see for us. And so the other big thing that we've observed is that the principle of free market competition is still very important. And so it's still important over time that the network has that element to it, so it can't be gamed, right? And so similarly, and that's been something that's really a question mark at this moment in time, with how do we start in a point where larger central agents who control a lot of the network early on agree over time to seize control over certain aspects of the network, as well as ensure that they distribute value across different stakeholders so the network evolves consistently and well. And I think we've seen a lot of different efforts of a lot of different stakeholders to do that. So you have folks like Polychain who invest and run validators. And so, there's a lot of different examples of how people are thinking about it, and how they're, moving across the value chain, providing different services. So sitting in the middle of a lot of these conversations is really fascinating for us. And we've seen that networks are getting a lot smarter very quickly in making sure that, you don't have 3, 4, 5 nodes in a network that dictate what's going on. And so for us, just, I kind of want to bring it quickly back to that. So, really what that means initially is that we provide all sorts of different type of staking services, including for block stacks, where there's retail investors, financial institutions, and then long-term financial institutions, investment funds. And the degree of management we provide is different per customer cohort. But the important thing for us is that we try to be true to the network and offer something to a lot of different stakeholders. And so we, for example, allow people to pay us with dollars, with fees. So we have a very hybrid model in order to come into a network and really learn about it. And one of the big things in the network, and I'm just going to go back here, is that we've seen is that it's kind of, I would say it's kind of a requirement to be one of the first let's say 50 nodes in a network, if you want to grow with the network consistently in a manner that allows for true innovation and tooling to be developed that's appropriate for the respective community. Because these networks are all based on Discords and Riot channels and Telegram groups. And it's actually very difficult to become an expert in a network once you're a year and a half in. The network strategy, the economics also early on in the first 12 months of a mainnet, normally what we see is that there's quite a lot of different decisions being made, even I'd say after the first 3 months of a mainnet launch around denomination. There was just a big one on Polkadot, for example. Naming conventions, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of the things that are hard to that you're not a part of if you actually come into these networks late. And so bringing stability is another core component when we look into these networks. And so the other big thing for us is that we are bringing performance to these networks very, very early, just because we do automate a lot of this stuff, and we have a lot of tools in place. In order to ensure that investors can also participate early without incurring risk. One of them is that we, for example, eliminate the risk around any slashing events. And mostly we can do that because the way our software operates, for example, double signing is just not something that's possible on any of our nodes. And if it's uptime related, we'll cover it just mostly because, our goal is to have perfect uptime. And so we actually have really stringent requirements and teams in place in order to ensure that that's the ambition. And so we try to make it very seamless for these networks early on to have very high performance nodes, as well as bringing on large stakeholders to participate in the network early. And so that's been our strategy when we look into this market. And so we'll be announcing a few things as well on Blockstack this week, where that's a good example of a project we started working with early, where we have a complete tool set for the ecosystem over time. And I'm not going to talk about the specific one for Blockstack, but in general, what we do is, outside of the individualized nodes that we run for investors and early day stakeholders, we run public validators. We bring in universities early on. We try to aid the network in defining who are good other network custodians on the network. And then we build API tools, for example, to allow for exchanges and custodians and other validators to easily extract the right information that they need. And then over time, we actually develop plugins that people can use on-prem. And so we end our story always with our strategy in the long run is to be like a Datadog. So it's actually the monitoring modules and deployment scripts that we write ourselves early on in order to automate the managed node service is something we'll hand over to the community over a period of time. So people can use these for themselves, and these are all open sourced and then ultimately ideally for free. And then we sell certain services on top of it, like, for example, alerting systems, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, and so that's us. I'm going to go back and let me have a quick look, and I'll stop screen sharing for a minute. And let me see if we have any particular questions. If you guys have anything you want to ask. I have one question in here. Are you muted? We can't hear you. I hope I'm not muted at this moment in time. But I see one comment also just in the chat window. So yeah, one interesting thing with full archive nodes, obviously, is Ethereum is like 14 terabytes. That's true. We actually are always thinking one Ethereum archive node at any given point in time, just because it's such a pain, and we always want to have one in rotation that just catches up to the standard ones we run APIs on, as well as, we do have customers who want one. But syncing those type of nodes is just massive. And so it's another interesting point. If you run a lot of nodes early on in a network, these nodes build up that archive themselves. And so, Ethereum, that's hard for us because when we started the business in 2017, we actually, obviously Ethereum already had a ton of history on it. And so that's been really interesting to see. And protocols, John mentioned it, change very often. I think one of the things we've seen a lot also as a trend in the industry is that more and more people are considering outsourcing it because the complexity of these, the reality is the initial launches are all a little clunky, and just because everyone tries to adhere to a degree of decentralization, so there are a lot of different stakeholders, and it's just very hard to manage that. And so that's been really interesting. And so what advice would you give to someone entering the proof of stake space and wanting to learn about the pros and cons of various networks? And so, well, great other question. One of the things I would say is another ambition we have is that we're a centralized repository. I don't know if that sounds good or bad. That BlockDaemon is a space where we actually have a marketplace where each of the protocols, at least we support, have a landing page. And in that landing page, you can find the machine requirements, software requirements, et cetera, needed in order to delegate a node. We're working on expanding that also with an economical setup. So ideally that developers can decide themselves, what type of machine specs are needed, what do I need to do in order to do this well, and then what are the potential economics around it. So that's been really interesting for us. And so for us, like the knowledge base is a good point. We run one, and because we work with so many different protocols and we have quite a few customers, we're maintaining a fairly large archive of support articles, for example. And so we're kind of really conscious and thinking about ways to make those more searchable and more approachable so people can really learn about it. So we have another question here: how to sustain funding and human resources in time, the custodial work for a network. So I think one of the things, if I understand the question correctly, is how does a node operator sustain funding and also the time needed in order to actually operate nodes without losing too much money? Because it's actually true that most networks, and specifically, for example, incentivized test nets, I'd say something that we kind of stopped, or we're thinking heavily about stopping participating in them, because the amount of work early in a network that you need to do in order to actually run a high functioning validator requires so much work that the rewards are often not aligned with the degree of work you need. And so the incentivized test nets are great about learning things, but we find it very difficult to make derive economical value out of them unless we can somehow connect it to a grant proposal and something else. And so I think so that's been interesting. Like the economical models also to sustain validators are evolving aggressively, I think, over time. It's not an easy business to just run nodes. So for validator nodes and earn a fee, for example. So for us, our main business model is actually complete outsourced infrastructure that can be used by exchanges and custodians and other large sort of entities who require clusters of nodes, high availability nodes, et cetera, et cetera. We have another question here. From a security and resilient perspective, what keeps you up at night? I mean, I think, there's a lot of things that keep me up at night. I think from my perspective, obviously, I actually care about our networks that we support a lot. And so I don't like network stalling, or I don't like networks to be too decentralized over time. And so what I worry about is that networks and protocols get hijacked and make wrong governance decisions early on that are impossible to replicate later on. And you've seen lots of arguments from Steemit to others where these type of things come up, and that's something that worries me a lot. I think the other thing from a more technical perspective that I have to say, which is that I feel that there's still, we're still very early when it comes to actual network resilience. There's a lot that could be improved, I'd say, across any networks. And so I would say that most of the networks we operate with are definitely improving over time, but they're still come short when it comes to the security and performance that we're used to in non-blockchain related cloud architecture. And so bringing a lot of the tooling from that area into the blockchain space to allow, for example, entities who are more used to, kind of ISO compliance, really rigorous network standards, security standards, et cetera, is something that we're trying to bridge, right? So we're trying to connect the sort of intense, specific experience you get from working with protocols early, and then also bringing that to large potential institutions to interact with them and meet them halfway when it comes to what do they need in order to connect their infrastructure to something like a decentralized network. And so one of the things, for example, is when you go for particular external audit requirements on the security side is, and then it gets tricky. Like, you need background checks on your employees, all that type of stuff, right? Like, so how do we make sure that anyone who ever touches a node is someone we trust, and also that we manage our own access very, very carefully. So we've spent a long time fine-tuning our own security in order to ensure that we're, not a single point of failure. And so if you guys are curious about, what we're doing, and go to blockdaemon.com. We have a marketplace. There's some free stuff in there. We offer some free Ethereum and Bitcoin shared nodes. There's a knowledge base with a bunch of different articles, and there's a lot more to come over the next couple of months. But I think you might find it interesting to play around with it. And I look forward to seeing you guys around, and ideally, see you when Blockstack keeps evolving as a network custodian. All right, we left 2 minutes, unless there's any that's it, I guess. We can run down the clock, or you guys should.
So we can wrap up this session.
Great.
Thanks so much, Konstantin. This was great.
Anytime. Thank you.
Thank you.